So as a result of this splendid little war, the United States is going to sign the Treaty of Paris. Now, of course, we've had the one in 1763 that ended the French and Indian War, the 1783 that ended the American Revolution, and now 1898. And as a result of beating Spain, Cuba is going to become independent. But the United States is going to receive other parts of the Spanish Empire. Like it's going to get Puerto Rico. It also continues to occupy Manila, pending a transfer of power back to the Philippines. So there's going to be this question of like hanging on to the Philippines at least temporarily before we sort of decide what to do with it. So as a result of winning a war against this aging Spanish Empire, much as we had sort of beaten an inferior, Mexican army in the Mexican-American War some 50 years earlier, it boosted American self-confidence. And it reinforced belief, and this is really, again, in this late Gilded Age, fueled by racism and social Darwinism, that the United States really had this manifest destiny to reshape the world in its own image. And so there's a guy, Josiah Strong, who gives a very Darwinian argument in favor of manifest destiny. And again, he says, the wonderful progress of the United States was really an illustration of Darwin's concept of natural selection, since Americans had demonstrated that they were the world's superior civilization, a race of unequaled energy who represented the largest liberty, the purest Christianity, the highest civilization in the world, a race of superior people destined to spread itself all over the earth. Really, that the United States had a Christian duty as well as an economic opportunity to expand Anglo-Saxon influence. And now, it doesn't feel that different necessarily than the way the United States had operated going, from east to west across the continent. It's now really sort of putting it out there on the world stage. Now, William McKinley, the president, in this era of people like Josiah Strong promoting what the United States should do in terms of continuing to civilize and Christianize and take on economic opportunity, he's got to figure out, what do we do with the Philippines? Because the treaty left the political status of the Philippines unresolved. American business leaders want the United States to keep the islands so they can get closer to China. You've got American missionaries, who are mostly Protestant, who view the Philippines as a base from which they can bring Christianity to, quote, their little brown brothers and sisters. Again, not my words, theirs. Interestingly, American authorities end the Roman Catholic Church's role as the official religion of the islands. They'd been controlled by Spain. They were Catholic, so it wasn't like we were bringing Christianity to them per se. We were bringing Protestantism to these Catholic lands. So William McKinley famously has sort of this late night, crisis of confidence, and he's trying to figure out what he should do with the Philippines. And he thought to himself, I can't get the Philippines back to Spain. That would be cowardly and dishonorable. It would also be weird to defeat the Spanish and then give them right back. But he also couldn't give the Philippines over to France or Germany, who already had an Asian influence, because that would be bad business overall, because it would be hurting the United States in the process. But also, you couldn't leave the Filipinos to themselves. That was the belief, that they're unfit for self-government. It would lead to anarchy. Again, it would be irresponsible to take away, the United States' civilizing influence. So instead, they came to the idea the United States just had to take the Philippines. It had to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize them through Christianity. So at the end of the day, the motivating influences of taking the Philippines, which would be really starting to build an American empire, would be national glory, commerce, racial superiority, and Protestant evangelism. So as people are debating this treaty, the Treaty of Paris, you've got sort of the anti-expansionists versus the people that are arguing again for glory and commerce and racial superiority and evangelism. And the anti-expansionists say, listen, if you take control of the former Spanish colonies, you'd basically be violating the long-standing principle embodied in the Constitution that people should be self-governed. Was that not the idea both of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? And so you've got people like William Jennings Bryan, who we know actually lost for president in 1896, as well as 1900, an election we're not looking at. And he argued that, interestingly, even though he was against really taking over the Philippines, he actually said that the treaty should be ratified quickly, because if you ratify the treaty, that would allow the Filipinos to become independent more, with more speed, but McKinley had no intention of doing that. So for him, he actually liked the fact that William Jennings Bryan was pushing a faster treaty, but he had no intention of actually making the Filipinos free. So what you're going to have happen here is ultimately the Filipinos look around and they're like, wait a second, I thought that the Americans were helping us be free from the Spanish so we could be independent. That's why Emilio Algonado had, really been so quick to help the Americans fight the Spanish. But the Filipinos look at their situation and say the Americans haven't left. So the Filipinos declare their independence, now really from everybody, including America, and they name Algonado the president. And a month later, an American soldier outside Manila fires on Algonado's national forces, who are known as the insurrectos, kills 2 of them. So at this point, U.S. Army Command orders his troops to assault the insurrectos, beginning a full-scale armed conflict. And the Filipino Republic declares war against the United States. So this is not, the Philippines-American War, which runs from 1899 to 1902, is not really an official war, but it really was going to force the United States to really hunker down and really take over the Philippines in order to have conquest there, to sort of keep them in line, which was fundamentally at odds with the founding principles of the United States. Again, that people had the right to govern themselves. So during this particular war, quote unquote, it gets pretty bad. There's guerrilla warfare on both sides. There's sort of a proto sort of concentration camps that are used. There's water torture that gets used. It's really sort of an ugly moment in the United States history. And so as this nasty guerrilla warfare is going on, it inspires a debate in the United States. And you have a group called the American Anti-Imperialist League. And they come together with Andrew Carnegie as the main money man behind the organization. But Samuel Gompers is one of the main spokesmen for the League, and he's opposed to annexation because he says, again, we don't want the United States to have the Philippines, because if we have the Philippines, that'll make it much easier for cheap Filipino labor to come to the United States, thereby undermining unions, because remember, unions don't really want immigration because they don't want cheap laborers. And so Gompers objects to, Senator George Hoare objects to the annexation of the Philippines by saying, no power is given to our federal government to acquire territory to be held and governed permanently as colonies, or to conquer alien people and hold them in subjugation. So we can fight wars, but we can't just take over other people. Now, it's opposed by, or I should say, the opponents of annexation are opposed by those people that are vocal supporters of annexation. So Senator Alfred Beveridge, interestingly of Indiana of all places, says, listen, we've got to think about China's illimitable markets, namely just the limitless markets it has. And truly, the power that rules the Pacific is going to rule the world. And that the U.S. is producing more than it can consume. We absolutely need new markets for our produce and our commerce. Now, ultimately, the United States government policy does agree with Beveridge and goes against what Gompers and Carnegie and the Anti-Imperialist League were about, and that it does try to hold on to the Philippines by force, and ultimately does sort of put down their insurrection, quote unquote, fully by 1902. Now, focusing back on Cuba, remember, the United States in the Teller Amendment had, quote, told the world, told Cuba, told Spain, listen, we're not in this war in order to take Cuba. But once they do get Cuba, they say you can be independent under certain conditions, and that's what's known as the Platt Amendment. So technically, Cuba could never impair its independence by signing a treaty with a third power. That's sort of almost like what we had talked about earlier in the lecture with Hawaii early on with that reciprocal trade agreement for sugar. Here is, you can be free, but you've got to be on your own. You can't ally with anybody else, which is going to become really interesting deep into the Cold War when Russia builds missiles right in Cuba. We're going to have the Cuban Missile Crisis. But also that it's got to keep its debt within the government's power to repay it out of ordinary revenues, basically saying you can't fall in debt. And sort of the third part is you have to acknowledge the right of the United States, 90 miles away, to intervene whenever it sees fit. So you can be independent, but there's going to be a little asterisk because we can intervene anytime we see fit. And lastly, you have to sell or lease the United States lands to be used for coaling or naval stations, which will later lead to a very, very important and controversial base called Guantanamo Bay that is used by the Navy. So again, Cuba's free, but not entirely. Now we're going to shift back from Cuba back to the Far East. I apologize for this geographic jumping around. Now, the term spheres of influence is an interesting one because it refers to territories that European countries control. But it's weird because they haven't actually taken over parts of, and this is specifically in China. So European countries have taken over sort of slices of China, and they've done it without annexing it. So they've sort of used their their military might as well as their economic interests to sort of come in and call the shots within certain areas, and the Chinese government was never really strong enough to do anything about it. So the United States introduces something called the open door policy. And this is something that Secretary of State John Hay announces. He doesn't consult the Chinese, but he basically says China should remain an open door to European and American trade, and that nations should not try to have these spheres of influence, which is interesting. It sort of sounds like the United States is making this really sort of benevolent and magnanimous statement. It's a little weird because the United States have been so late to the game that many people could have read it as, you know what, the United States was saying that no one should do it just so they can sort of get their way in on it because they didn't have a sphere of influence. Now, none of the European powers, except for Britain, actually accept Hay's principles. But since none of them reject it either, Hay pretty much thinks that all the major powers accept it. Now, this whole open door policy had been motivated by the desires of American businesses to exploit and ultimately dominate Chinese markets. So, despite the fact that it sounds generous and sort of high-minded and noble, it's really just a way to say China should be open sort of to everybody, not to these European powers that have carved it up. But it also appealed to those who opposed imperialism because it does, at the same time, sound noble in terms of pledging to keep China from being carved up by powerful European nations. But like the Monroe Doctrine way back in 1823, this policy was of little legal standing. Now, there are going to be Chinese who are very pissed off about American involvement, American potential involvement, but really the Western European involvement that had been there now for decades. And so you've got a group called the Boxers, or the Fists of Righteous Harmony, who are pissed off at the foreign investment and Christian missionary efforts that have gone on. And these Chinese nationalists, the Boxers, lay siege to foreign embassies in Beijing, which at the time is still known as Peking. And so they rise up, again, sort of trying to take China back from these Westerners. And an expedition of British, German, Russian, Japanese, and American soldiers actually have to come in and rescue these international diplomats who are being threatened and vulnerable by these Boxers. Now, Hay looks at the situation. He worries that the intervention would open the door for countries to sort of dismember China. So we've got this instability now. They're going to sort of carve it up again. So the United States makes this, revised open door statement that says the United States would preserve Chinese territorial and administrative integrity as well as equal and impartial trade with all parts of the Chinese empire. So again, sort of in order to maintain this United States opportunity to get in, it's going to sort of have sort of open door policy sort of 2.0. Now, you've got Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt had been the Undersecretary of the Navy. He's going to become Vice President of the United States the second time that McKinley runs. And then McKinley's going to get assassinated, and Teddy is going to take over. Now, Teddy was very much a guy who believed in Alfred Thayer Mahan's ideas. He's motivated by the white man's burden. And he's convinced that the civilized and barbarian people of the world face this inevitable conflict. And the United States is sort of this great white knight that is going to come in with its civilizing power and take control of other regions to bring law and order and righteousness to backward people. And he believed that American imperialists would be missionaries of sort of civic virtue, not colonial masters. It's not like we're going to take it over like the British did. We're actually going to help improve it. And so we'll talk right at the beginning of the next lecture about Teddy Roosevelt's involvement both in Latin America as well as what happens relative to Japan.